What's up, Wizards? It's the D and the Z. We're in the Heezy from the SBMTGZ down there, and it's time for some more Kaldheim previews. I tried to make that rhyme. I'm still doing it. All of this rhymes, so I guess it counts. But anyway, I had a lot to talk about today because for the first time ever, I missed a preview day yesterday. I'm sorry about that. Don't worry about me. I'm fine, although it was a weird one yesterday. Maybe I'll talk about it sometime in the future on a stream or something. But for now, you don't care about that. You don't care about me. You just care about these cards. So let's talk about those. And I know. Some of you do care about me. I get it. Show that love, like, subscribe, do all that stuff. But I want to go ahead and start by talking about some of the best cards from today. And then we'll clean up some of the better cards from yesterday that I missed. Now, there were some really good uncommon things that we got to see this morning, like Crush the Weak, Basalt Ravager, and Dual Strike. All three of these red cards, and all three, I think, somewhat playable in their own way. Crush the Weak is 3 mana, 2 and a red for a sorcery that deals 2 damage to each creature. If a creature dealt damage this way would die this turn, exile it instead. You can foretell this for a red mana, of course after you pay 2 mana, and slap it into exile face down. Now, this is actually, I think, really awesome for the Giants decks. You know, they needed a kind of low-grade sweeper that doesn't really hit any of their creatures, and this is perfect for that. It doesn't hit Bone Crusher or really anything on up, so I like the look of this card. But moving on to Basalt Ravager, this is 4 mana, 3 and a red for a 4/2 giant wizard, and when it ETBs, it deals X damage to any target, where X is the greatest number of creatures you control that have a creature type in common. Interesting. So it's a giant. It could go into the Giants decks. It's only 4 mana. Yeah, the toughness is really, really low on this, but I guess the power is at least somewhat up to snuff. Now, I don't love the rate on it or anything, but if this does like 3 extra damage to any target at all, that's kind of cool. Then it's not too bad, you know? It actually counts itself so long as, again, you're naming giants or wizards, for that matter. This could also go in the, you know, artisan wizards deck that is kind of a thing right now. So I kind of like that too, but you could also get really sneaky and play like, what is it, Maskwood Nexus, or any of the cards that make all of your creatures the same creature type. You could play a bunch of changelings if you wanted to. You could play this in Elves as your red splash if you're that dedicated to making this card as jank as possible. There's a lot of really cool things you can do with this. It's kind of like a gray merchant of Asphodel in a way. And I really, really like the idea behind it, but I'm not sure it actually ends up seeing too much play outside of some really janky stuff that you'll definitely see here on the channel. But moving on to Dual Strike, a fork, ladies and gentlemen. It's a downgraded fork. It's 2 red mana for an instant. Whenever you cast your next instant or sorcery spell with converted mana cost 4 or less this turn, copy that spell. You may choose new targets for the copy, and of course this also randomly has foretell, just 1 red mana and you pay 2 to do the thing. So this, interesting. You can copy all kinds of cool stuff with this, both in standard and historic, and even modern, dare I say, although I think modern probably has better double cast effects than this already, and historic might too, but I don't know, I just like seeing good old fork, even though it's not, obviously it's not quite fork, you know, it forking sucks that you can only do stuff, you can only copy spells 4 casting cost or less, but all things considered, it's just interesting to see fork, almost fork in standard. Not sure it'll actually do much of anything, but fork effects are at least cool. I think we can all agree on that. But I was pretty impressed by a couple of mythics today, starting with Starnheim Unleashed. This is 4 mana, 2 and 2 white for a sorcery. Create a 4/4 white angel warrior creature token with flying and vigilance. If the spell was foretold, create X of those tokens instead. Oh, and it foretells for double X and a white. I didn't say that the first time I read it. I apologize. But anyway, I like this card because it does so many things. It does so many things. This is a turn 3 Sarah Angel. That's pretty good. You know, turn 3 4/4 Flying Vigilance isn't bad, but you're still paying as much as you would pay for a Sarah Angel. You're just doing it in installments. So that's not too bad if you don't mind soaking up your turn 2, so long as you guaranteed get a turn 3 Sarah. It's just not bad stats, obviously. And a lot of these angel tribal decks that people are going to be definitely building, myself included, once the new format hits, probably won't have too many options for a 2-drop in the first place, so you probably won't mind foretelling this most of the time, but obviously you're really telegraphing it a lot of the time when you do that in your angels deck. But of course the card does more than that. It's a turn 4 Sarah Angel. It's still better than Sarah Angel if you just want to cast it naturally. But, of course, after you've foretold it, it can be a 5 mana 2 Sarah Angel, so like a 5 mana Amiria's Call, which is what this card I think compares most to. Do you play both of them in the same deck? I guess if you're playing Angels specifically, yeah, you'll play both of these in the same deck, but this doesn't have the upside of being a land when you can't otherwise cast it, but it does have the upside, to Emeria's Call at least, of having more available modes to actually cast the card. You know, has a lot of different mana cost at which you can cast this and get a lot of value out of it. Once you do have like 7 mana that you would normally use to cast Call, well, suddenly you can create 3 Angel tokens rather than the normal 2. So I really like the rate of this, almost no matter what rate we're talking about. And of course, really late in the game when you've got all the mana in the world, it's definitely a finisher. But I guess in a lot of cases, Emeria's Call is a finisher too. So are you just winning more with a card like this? I don't know. I think it's really flexible, and I think it's probably going to find its way into somewhere. But the other mythic from the day is Burning Rune Demon. Bard is 6 mana, 4 and 2 black for a 6/6 demon berserker with flying. And when it ETBs, you may search your library for exactly 2 cards not named Burning Rune Demon that have different names. If you do, reveal those cards. An opponent chooses one of them, put the chosen card into your hand and the other into your graveyard, and then shuffle your library. It's pretty hilarious that you put the other one into your graveyard, so like you're still getting the other card in a lot of situations, whether you want to reanimate it or escape it or flash it back or whatever you want to do with the card that you also slot into your graveyard. Who cares? You're kind of just drawing 2 cards off of this if your deck is equipped to get that other card out of your graveyard and use it somehow. So card, I think this is good. I think this is better than Demon Lord Bells Unlock. A lot of people have been comparing this to DBZ lately, and I think this is better. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that 6 mana is pretty not so bad. It is steep, don't get me wrong. I've called 4 mana steep a bunch of times this previous season, but I think 6 mana for this particular effect is really good because it at least replaces itself with a card when it ETBs, so that's kind of nice. You do have a 6/6 Flampler guy worth of stats. Actually, it's not Flample, it's just flying, but it's still pretty good. And you could say that, again, that you've effectively drawn 2 cards off of playing this thing. If you can blink it or reanimate it in some way before you get to 6 mana, that seems awesome too. This card does a lot of awesome stuff, tutoring for 2 things. Getting effectively the second best card in your deck when you cast this is pretty awesome. It seems like good card advantage for like a mono black control deck. But I'm not sure if you play this over Massacre Worm, but maybe you just play like one of each and that works out. Either way, I'm interested to see how the card labs, but I'm not sure the card is amazing yet, but I'm throwing some of my support behind the card because I do like, giant bodies your opponent has to deal with that also get you one of the best cards in your deck at the moment. Even if they deal with this, you still have another card they have to deal with. So, I don't know. Seems pretty decent to me, even if the cost is relatively high. But let's move on to yesterday's cards that I missed, and there are some commons and uncommons in this batch that I do think are very much worth talking about. Like, there are 3 black commons that I'm really interested in: Elderfang Disciple, Feed the Serpent, and Wither Crown. Now, Elderfang Disciple is just 2 mana, 1 and a black for a 1/1 elf cleric, and when it ETBs, each opponent discards a card. So it's a burglar rat, but it's got really, really good creature types. It's like the best burglar rat in terms of creature types that's ever existed. Now, I know there's a human rogue burglar rat with an extra toughness right now in standard, so that's a pretty good card too. But obviously this is good for elves. I'm gonna throw that out there, and it's especially good for clerics. Is it a decent 2-drop in clerics that's worth playing over some of the other 2-drops we have access to right now? Well, if you're on Arena and Best of 1, I guess you get to play Hallowed Priest or whatever it's called. But for people that play actual standard Magic, maybe this is a decent 2-drop for the standard deck that fills the space of the Arena cards you would otherwise be playing in Best of 1. So I think this is actually a really cool call. I like the idea of being able to mess with the opponent's hand in the clerics deck before you really get started going online with your clerics shenanigans. So I do think the card is cool, and I'm wondering, I want to lab with it, and I'm wondering if it makes the clerics deck any better. But moving on to Feed the Serpent, this is a Vraska's Contempt. That doesn't gain you life. This is 4 mana, 2 and 2 black for an instant. Exile a creature or planeswalker. Altogether, we already have a card. The E2 Extinction is just better than this card in standard. It really doesn't see any play, but is this decent in Pauper? Might be a little bit too slow, all things considered, but I think this is really meant for limited more than anything, and budget-minded players. If you really care about budget, this is for you. But instant speed, exile a creature or planeswalker is always going to be a really powerful effect, especially in limited, where this might end up being the best removal spell in the entire set. But moving on to Wither Crown, this piqued my interest. This is just 1 and a black for an aura that enchants a creature. Enchanted creature has base power 0, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you lose 1 life unless you sacrifice this creature. So the first thing I thought was like Hateful Eidolon Lurrus decks that usually just have like Deadweight and Mire's Grasp to take out smaller creatures, but they have a problem taking out larger creatures. And they don't really have a thing that can take out larger creatures and can also be brought back with Lurrus. And this solves that problem for those decks. So this kind of caught my eye. I'm not sure it's a great card, but I at least, again, want to lab with this in those Lurrus Eidolon decks to see if it's worth its anything, really. There are a couple of other black uncommons from yesterday that are at least worth bringing up, like Tegrid's Shadow, and probably the more interesting one, Herald. Good old Herald, King of Skemfar. Now, Tegrid's Shadow is just kind of a barter in blood in a way. Is that the card I'm thinking of? We'll see. It's 5 mana, 3 and 2 black for an instant. Each player sacks 2 creatures. You can foretell this for 2 and 2 black. So if you do foretell this, you cast it on turn 4, it's probably really good, especially in a mono black control deck that doesn't have creatures of its own to sacrifice, unless, of course, you want to be sacrificing your creatures in an Aristocrats build or something like that. This could be decent, but I especially like it in these mono black builds where it's just a 2 for 1, even on turn 5. That's not horrible, depending on what you're playing against, and it could be especially good against creatures that are difficult to take out, like Dream Trawler and whatnot. But moving on to the elf boy here. This is 3 mana, 1, a black, and a green for a 3/2 elf warrior. It's a legend, and it has menace. Whenever Herald, King of Skemfar, enters the battlefield, Skemfar is not a word that rolls off the tongue, but whenever it ETBs, look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may reveal an elf, warrior, or Tyvar card from among them, put it into your hand, put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So this reminds me of Acclaimed Contender, but it always gets its ETB trigger. You don't have to have a creature of a certain type to actually get the ETB trigger. And it has Menace, which is a pretty good ability, but all in all, I'm not too sure about this, especially in like Historic Elves, where you've got a bunch of 3-drop Anthem effects that you would probably much rather play than this card advantage piece, although, and it's really not card advantage, it's more just replacing itself, it's card selection. But it's really good card selection, I'll say that much. Getting a specific elf thing from the top of your deck is always good, but again, I'm not sure that it slots in place of other 3-drops you might rather be playing. And in Standard, if there is a Black-Green Elves deck, this might make the cut, but I actually don't think you play like 3 or 4 copies of this legend. This is probably more of a 2 of, because again, Acclaimed Contender hasn't really been an amazing card, and it hasn't pushed Knights to the upper echelons of playability, and even when Knights were playable, the Acclaimed Contender was never really an include in that deck. It was always much lower on the curve, and I think Elves might function very similarly to those kind of decks. So this might actually be just a little too expensive, amazingly enough, for the Elves decks to play, depending on how optimized they are. But there are a couple of uncommon sagas from yesterday that are really good looking to me. First, there's Kaldheim's Vicious Return. This is 4 mana, 2, a black and a red. You may sacrifice a creature in Chapter 1. When you do, Kaldheim's Vicious Return deals 3 damage to any target. On Chapter 2, each player discards a card. Remember that, each player. And on Chapter 3, return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. Whoops. Put a +1/+1 counter on it. It gains haste until your next turn. So I really like this thing, you know. If you are able to sacrifice like a Serrated Scorpion the turn this comes into play, your opponent will sack a dude. Or at least you'll be able to hit them for 3 or any of their creatures for 3, so you get to bolt something. That doesn't seem too bad at all. Each player discards a card. On Chapter 2, that means that not only does your opponent get rid of something, which is of course good, but you can just drop whatever you want to reanimate on the next turn into the bin and get it on turn 6, which is a little bit late in the game, but being able to reanimate a thing on turn 6 and give it haste, by the way, is not too bad if you're able to do some other cool stuff before your turn 6. You know, things like Timurid Calls the Dead or Mire Triton that mill yourself can also be really good with this card. I think it might be a mana too slow, all things considered, but these kinds of reanimation effects that also have like removal and discard stapled to them really seem like value factories, and I'm super into it, so I want to play with this card. But the best saga from today also starts the rares from today. This is Herald Unites the Elves. which is going to be funny every time I say it. Herald unites the elves. It's 4 mana, 2 a black and a green for a saga. You know that already. Chapter 1, you mill 3 cards. You may put an elf or Tyvar card from your graveyard onto the battlefield. In Chapter 2, you can put a +1/+1 counter on each elf you control. And in Chapter 3, whenever an elf you control attacks this turn, target creature an opponent controls gets -1/-1 until end of turn. Now, this is an amazing saga. Just because of Chapter 1, y'all. I mean, first of all, I've seen some people asking this, what is a Tyvar card? It's the Planeswalker we saw the other day. It's the elf Planeswalker. Although, I imagine that you could also put a Tyvar creature, if there is a Tyvar creature in the history of Magic, ever from here to now, or from now into eternity. If there ever is a Tyvar that's not an elf, well, you can put it on the battlefield. But mostly we're talking about standard right now, so the Tyvar Planeswalker. But if you can just throw a good elf into your graveyard somehow before turn 4 rolls around, you get a really sweet reanimation trigger on this. And if we have like expensive elves in standard before it's all said and done, we got some good reanimation targets. But as it is right now, we don't have too many amazing reanimation targets. Do remember though that this works with changelings as well, so reanimating a changeling might be really cool on turn 4. But anything that you happen to have lost, you can reanimate. If you did play Herald itself on turn 3 and your opponent had removal for it, well, on turn 4 you can play Herald Unites the Elves, reanimate your Herald, get some more card advantage. That seems pretty cool right there. But obviously, Chapter 2 just, reward you for going wide, which you want to do in your Elves deck anyway. And then Chapter 3 is crazy. If you just attack with like 3 elves and kill 1 to 2 creatures, that seems unbelievable. So I just like everything about this saga right here, especially if you can't tell. Chapter 1, which I think is the best part of the saga, and that sometimes makes a saga good. Chapter 1 being a decent chapter. You look at Elspeth Conquers Death. Maybe the best chapter on that is Chapter 1, although you could argue it's Chapter 3, don't get me wrong. But the fact that Chapter 1 does something so good makes ECD an amazing saga. And the same thing I think is going to be true of this card. But let's talk about Tibalt's Trickery. And I should save this card till the end because I think it's an incredible card. This is just 1 in a red for an instant. Counter target spell. It says that. It's 2 mana for a counterspell. It's red. Choose 1, 2, or 3 at random. Its controller mills that many cards, then exiles cards from the top of their library until they exile a non-land card with a different name than the spell they cast that you've countered. They may cast that card without paying its mana cost. Then they put the exiled cards on the bottom of their library in a random order. So a lot of people saying that this is terrible, but here's the thing. If you counter the thing that's going to win them the game, you really don't care what they get. At all. At all. Even if they get something that's like slightly better mana value than the thing they originally cast, again, not a big deal. So long as you're using this to counter the spell that effectively wins in the game, who cares? Who cares? You still kept them from doing it. If they cast an Embercleave that would win them the game, no. If they cast a Genesis Ultimatum or an Egon that would win them the game, no, you just don't get that. Sorry. I just think this is actually really, really sweet, and I'm not sure how many like main deck slots you would ever dedicate to this card unless it's 4. I'm not sure that's the case. I mean, you're giving your opponent free cards one way or the other. But again, when you're countering the most high-impact thing in their deck, if they go turn 3 Lovestruck Beast and then turn 4 Great Hinge or something, I kind of don't care that they're going to get another card off of this. All I really care is that they don't get their Great Hinge, which is the best card in their deck. So, again, there's a lot of plays in Standard that this counters and just completely neuters your opponent's game plan. So I'm kind of into it. All right, now we're getting into the stuff that everyone's freaking out about, like Jorn, God of Winter, and Kaldheim, the Rhyme Staff. Now, Jorn is 3 mana, 2 and a green for a 3/3 legendary snow god. And whenever it attacks you, untap each snow permanent you control. But Kaldheim, the Rhyme Staff, is 3 mana, Sultai colors, this whole card is. It's 1, a blue, and a black for a legendary snow artifact. That rhymes, by the way. You can tap it. You may play target snow permanent card from your graveyard this turn. If you do, it enters the battlefield tapped. Now, let's talk. So is Jorn busted? Is it Jorn to be wild? I don't know. I really don't. Maybe this is controversial, but I don't think this card is actually that great. I think it's a good card. It's a good Magic card. But it's definitely an interaction check, if nothing else. You play this on turn 3, and 3-mana 3/3s that are vanilla otherwise just aren't what they used to be. They haven't been in years, honestly. So I'm not too impressed by the stat line of the card. It has to wait an entire turn cycle before it actually does anything. And to be honest, cards like that historically over the last few years have not been good in standard. Cards that you have to wait an entire turn cycle and it has to attack safely. And it might only get to attack the one time before it dies, and then it doesn't even really double your mana. You can cast like a 4-drop. If your lands are all snow, I'll get to that in a second. You can cast 4-drop and then attack. And I guess it has pseudo-vigilance because it untaps itself because it's snow. And then you can cast another 4-drop on turn 2. So in that way, or on main phase 2, I guess. So in that way, it's kind of a Fires of Invention that you might only be able to use one time ever. And again, requires the restriction that you have snow permanents. I guess you untap other snow permanents too, so you're untapping all your other creatures. So it gives all your other creatures pseudo-vigilance, which is okay, I guess. If you have the artifact version of this and the creature in play, you can tap the artifact to play a land out of your graveyard, and then attack with Jorn, and untap the artifact, and then tap it on main phase 2 to play something real out of your yard. That's kind of cool. I guess if you tap the artifact to play a snow land out of your graveyard, it'll enter tapped, and then really whatever you play out of your graveyard with the artifacts after this will untap when you attack with Jorn. So that's kind of cool. There's a lot of little things going on with this card, but ultimately it's not really a mana doubler. It's really fragile. It's fragile when it attacks. I mean, are you ever even going to be able to use this mana doubling, quote unquote, more than once? Really, I mean, if your opponent is able to block profitably, you're kind of in trouble. But you have to actually be able to attack with the creature in the first place, and that's easier said than done in this standard, especially with so many creatures in this set that are effectively interaction checks. I imagine a lot of people are going to be sure that they force interaction into their decks after this set comes out, because there's a lot of stuff in this set and the last couple of sets that, if you play it and it lasts a turn, it's undeniably amazing. Like this card. If you can get this card online and actually attack more than once with it safely and, have the cards in your hand to effectively double your mana in a turn, cast a 4-drop and then a 4-drop and then a 5-drop and then a 5-drop. If you have enough mana to completely maximize the card, then or the cards in your hand to completely maximize the card, then suddenly it's amazing. But there's just a ton of hoops you have to jump through to do the most broken stuff this card does. But in the meantime, it's doing a lot of serviceable stuff for you, so it's not a bad card by any stretch. I'm not calling it a bad card, but it's just fine. It's just kind of fine. I guess after it dies later on in the game, if you're able to draw another copy of it, you just cast the Rhyme Staff. And then with the Rhyme Staff, you can get Jorn back from your graveyard over and over. So it's kind of sort of, so long as you draw extra copies of it in a game, it's kind of sort of resistant to removal and recursive in a way. So it's got that going for it. But again, even then, you get super late in the game and you're actually able to set Jorn up properly. Do you have the cards in your hand that you need to maximize the effectiveness of this card? I'm not sure. It just seems like it's really, really tough to do the broken stuff with the card. That's all I'm saying. But again, in the meantime, it's not bad. It really has to have snow cards that work well enough with it, and we've only seen half of the set so far. So the card could be really, really good depending on what kind of support it gets, but outside of snow lands, it hasn't really gotten too much support yet, and I'm not sure that it actually will. It's definitely the best snow card that we've seen so far, which has got to count for something, but I'm just not sure it's as good as a lot of people are freaking out about, right? I mean, people are losing their minds over this card, and I'm just not sure that's warranted. So let's move on to Toralf, God of Fury, and Toralf's Hammer, which is reminiscent of another hammer. But Toralf is 4 mana, 2 and 2 red for a 5/4 legendary god with trample. And whenever a creature or planeswalker an opponent controls is dealt excess non-combat damage, burn damage usually, Toralf deals damage equal to the excess to any target other than that permanent. And Toralf's Hammer is 2 mana, 1 and a red for a legendary equipment, with equip 1 and a red. Equipped creature has 1 red tap, unattach hammer. It deals 3 damage to any target, return hammer to its owner's hand. Equipped creature gets +3/+0 as long as it's legendary. This is a card people aren't freaking out about and probably should be. Now, I admit that the Hammer is really expensive, but it reminds me, of course, of Hammer of Bogardan, a card that I really liked back in the day. And it's better than Hammer of Bogardan because Hammer didn't come staple to a 5/4 on the other side. I mean, think about it this way. If you activate this once, the Hammer side of it. You activate it once, tap the creature it's attached to, bolt one of your opponent's creatures or something, and return the Hammer to your hand. Well, you have removed one of your opponent's creatures from their side of the table, and suddenly you got a 5/4 in your hand. That doesn't seem too bad at all. I mean, there are going to be times earlier on in the game where this is a pretty good equip just to have as removal, effectively, or even damage to the face. This is repeatable damage to the face, and even though it cost a lot of mana to do it, I still think that later on in the game, as long as you're set up enough in your control deck or whatever, repeatable damage to the face that also comes with an alternate win condition, a creature stapled to it, is actually, you could do worse than that in terms of win conditions, right? So, not bad. And if you do have a Toralf in play and a Hammer on the board, then suddenly, if you're able to bolt a thing for 2 damage and kill it, you can deal the excess damage to your opponent, that 1 damage. And that might matter. Sometimes you can kill like an Edgewall Innkeeper and like a 2 toughness creature along with it, just because you have Toralf and the Hammer in play. So I think that a repeatable source of damage that does require a creature to be in play, and a creature that can tap too, but still, a creature needs to be in play, but it's a repeatable source of damage that can come back to your hand later in the game and be the 5/4. I think that's actually just sturdy. It's a solid Magic card that I think people have just kind of been bored by. People think it's really slow, and it kind of is. I'll agree with you on that, but people are just kind of yawning at this card, and I think it's a lot better than it is at first glance. But let's get to the final card of the day. That's right, we're already there. How do we do that? That's what happens when you cut out all the fat, it turns out. Don't worry, I will do a video to close out spoiler season that's kind of the best of the rest cards I didn't talk about the last few days. We'll get to them all, but I do want to make time to talk about Egon, God of Death, who is a Ghostbuster. He comes stapled to Throne of the Dead, by the way, but Egon is 3 mana, 2 and a black for a 6/6 legendary god with Death Touch, and at the beginning of your upkeep, exile 2 cards from your graveyard. If you can't, sacrifice Egon and draw a card, but Throne of Death is just 1 black mana for a legendary artifact. At the beginning of your upkeep, mill a card, and you can pay 2 and a black and tap it to exile a creature from your yard and draw a card. So you get a Rotting Regisaur that isn't necessarily better, but it's close to Rotting Regisaur, I guess. And as long as you're milling yourself with Mire Trident or Timorous Calls or anything like that, then suddenly Egon is looking pretty sexy and actually like he's able to stay on the battlefield for a few turns. And that might be all that you need. This wields an Embercleave just as well as Reggie ever did. Actually, not quite as well as Reggie ever did, but at least this has the Death Touch, so if your opponent has to triple block your Egon to actually kill it, you're guaranteed to kill every single thing that blocks it, even if they have to quad block it, People say that a Death Touch on a 6/6 is kind of redundant, right? But this does keep your opponent from taking it down with a whole bunch of blocks that leave some of their creatures alive. If anything wants to block it, they're going down, so keep that in mind. But just a 6/6 for 3 mana is a pretty sweet deal, and if you're up against rogues, for instance, this is looking all the better, obviously. So I really like this card, just on the one half. But on the other side, I like the card too. It facilitates itself if you already have a copy, or if you start the game with 2 copies in your hand, you go ahead and throw down Throne, or whatever it is. It is a Throne, right? It is a Throne. You go ahead and throw down Throne on turn 1, and then by the time turn 3 rolls around, you'll have enough cards to exile to Egon. Obviously, Egon doesn't do anything the turn that you play it. I don't much care for creatures like that. I really don't. But when it's this overstated and this much of an interaction check, if your opponent doesn't have the Heartless Act, they're going to be in trouble. So that's pretty sweet. And even later on in the game, if your opponent is able to remove this, you draw another copy of it. If you think your opponent has more removal, or if you're just playing against control or something, you don't have to play the Egon half. You play the Throne half for 1 mana, and you'll probably have mana left over to start exiling stuff and drawing cards and winning that card advantage war against control. So both halves of this do interesting things against different kinds of decks, and it's got a huge spread of playability. Milling yourself is actually really sweet depending on what deck you're playing. I mean, does this take the place of an Oxyvagonus or two in the Kroxa decks, or does it step on Kroxa's feet too much to be playable alongside Kroxa in the same deck? These are interesting questions that I don't think are so cut and dried as yes or no. I think there's going to be labbing that has to be done before we are actually able to answer those questions. Because, I don't think you play this in the 4 of Kroxa deck, but maybe you play it in the 2 or 3 of Kroxa deck. That also has access to Embercleave and more creatures and stuff. I just think there's a cool little Rakdos deck coming together, and even a cool little mono black deck coming together that has a lot of interesting finishing pieces and some really good removal. And some card advantage pieces too. This is yet another card advantage piece for mono black control, so long as it plays the requisite number of creatures. So I just like everything this card does on both halves. I think it's a really cool piece, and it's probably going to see some amount of standard play somewhere, even if it doesn't slot into anything like right away. It's going to do something eventually. But that's all the crazy stuff from the last couple of days. And I know I left a few cards off the menu. But again, don't worry. I'll cover all the stuff that I missed towards the end of the spoiler season in kind of a wrap-up video. But don't worry. Don't worry, the rest of spoiler season, I will be on deck with everything that comes out, and my exclusive preview is coming up in just a couple of days, so make sure that you subscribe, hit the bell for the notifications to make sure you see that video, and all the other spoilers and previews and stuff like that from this season. It's been a good one. I like the look of this set, although it seems like I'm being a little bit more critical than usual. That's because I am. Because, not every card is going to be good. Not every rare or even mythic is going to be good. And I think it's important to be critical when you look at new cards and you review how good you expect them to be. But, I like a fair set. I like fair Magic, and it looks like we are trending more towards that. And it looks like my prediction about they won't print an unbelievably broken card in this set might actually come true, unless, of course, Jorn is what people think Jorn is, but I highly doubt it. But anyway, just let me know how you felt about everything down there in the comments section, any card that I did miss. Let me know, how much you want me to cover it, basically, and maybe I'll slip it in to the next couple of videos. But aside from that, again, just like, subscribe. You got me to 120K. Finally, we made it, y'all. I'm super happy about that. Very proud of all of us. And I cannot thank you enough that after a lot of grinding, we finally made it to 120K. So you might think my next goal would be like 125 or 150K. No, dog. We're going to get to 1 million subscribers. Let's at least get to 200,000. If you watch and you're not subbed yet, there's really no reason not to sub. Just takes a click or two. You'll get all the spoiler content, and aside from that, all of the new deck techs and stuff when Kaldheim does come out. So all the top 10s, top 25, the sleeper videos, all that. You want to be here for it. So sub, even if you don't usually sub to YouTube channels, your subscription would mean a lot to me. But aside from that, just check out the Patreon if you really want to support the channel. Link in the description, or patreon.com/SPMTG. $1 a month will let you vote on what decks and videos and stuff we do first for Kaldheim standards. So $1 a month is a pretty good deal, and you support the channel more than you can possibly understand. So help me out with that. And if you want to see me play Magic or talk about spoilers and stuff, or play other video games even, really considering playing like Hades or Mario 64 or like Chrono Cross back here on the stream sometime very soon. So if you want to see me do any of that stuff, including Magic content, even Magic content, then check out twitch.tv/SPMTGdev. That's where we play stuff. But anyway, I guess I'm done for this one. Sorry for all the self-promotion at the end. I have to do it. But I like this set so far, even though some people have accused me of hating this set with a passion. But I don't. I actually really like what I'm seeing so far because I like fair Magic. Just let me know how you feel about it down there, and I'll catch you cats later. I'm Deb from the place. Thanks for watching, my wizards. Spread love and be kind.